So the deep dive today focuses on the 10 major signs of the Day of Judgment, as narrated in the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And the source suggests these signs were actually shown to him in vision.
It's visions, right.
Yeah, and a key point the source makes right away is that these prophecies often use symbolic language. Think dream interpretation, like in the book of Daniel or Revelation. It's not always literal.
Okay, that's important context. Let's jump into the first big one then, the beast of the earth, or Dabiq al-Ard.
Dabiq al-Ard, yeah.
Now, the whole idea of empires or states being described as, well, living creatures, it sounds a bit strange at first.
It might seem that way, but it's actually quite common in religious texts. The Bible, the Qur'an, the Hadith. They all use this kind of metaphor for powerful entities.
So this beast of the earth, the Dabiq al-Ard, what does it represent according to the source?
It's presented as a really significant metaphor for oppressive expansionist states. Basically, a powerful land-based empire. The takeaway is that this seemingly fantastical creature actually points to real-world political forces.
Okay. And the source gives examples from older texts to back this up.
It does, yeah. Some really compelling ones from the Old Testament, particularly Daniel's visions.
Ah, Daniel's beast.
Exactly. The vision of the four beasts. What's interesting is how the specific details of each beast seem to map onto historical empires. It's not just random imagery.
So walk us through them. What's the first one?
First, there's the lion with eagle's wings, which then stands up like a human. This is interpreted as the Babylonian Empire, around 605 to 539 BCE.
The wings for speed, maybe? And then becoming human?
Yeah.
More established?
Something like that, yeah. Rapid rise, then a more subtle rule. Then comes the bear.
The bear.
Representing the Medo-Persian Achaemenid Empire, 539 to 331 BCE. Known for its sheer power and size, crushing strength.
Okay. And after the bear?
A leopard. But this one has 4 wings and 4 heads. This is linked to the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, 331 to 146 BCE.
4 heads. Because it's split after Alexander died, real?
Precisely. Split into 4 successor kingdoms. The symbolism matches.
And the last beast in that vision.
That's the really terrifying one. Iron teeth, 10 horns. Just described as dreadful and strong.
And that one is?
The Roman Empire, from 146 BCE onwards. A symbol of immense, almost brutal power and control.
Wow. The source also mentions another vision of Daniel's, right? With a ram and a goat?
Yes, that's another key example. The ram has 2 horns, representing the combined power of Media and Persia within the Achaemenid Empire.
And the goat?
The goat represents the Greek Empire under Alexander, charging and defeating the ram. Then the goat's big horn breaks, and 4 smaller horns grow.
Again, pointing to the division of Alexander's empire.
Exactly. The symbolism is consistent across these visions, linking beasts to empires.
Okay, so that's the Old Testament background. What about the New Testament? The source mentions beasts in Revelation.
Right. 3 main symbolic beasts there. First, the sea beast.
Sea beast. Roman naval power.
That's the interpretation. Emerging from the sea highlights its strength on the water. The 7 heads are seen as different imperial eras.
And it had blasphemous names.
Yes, signifying defiance against divine authority. The source even links the 42 months of its arrogance to the time frame of the Roman-Jewish War, around 6670 CE. So, a sea power defying God.
Okay. Then there's an earth beast.
Yes, Dabiq min al-Ard in Arabic. Similar phrasing to the Hadith. This one's linked to the church, specifically after the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE.
How so?
The interpretation is that this earth beast supported the sea beast's authority. It had 2 horns, like a lamb, maybe representing Constantinople and Rome, looking peaceful, but it spoke like a dragon.
Spoke like a dragon, meaning aggressive.
Meaning persecution, according to the source. Targeting non-Nicene Christians like the Arians, Donatists, Marcionites, Montanists, groups outside the newly established orthodoxy. So religious authority enforcing imperial power.
And the source links the defeat of these beasts to something specific.
It does. It connects their defeat to the historical defeat of the Romans by the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. This event significantly weakened both the Roman Empire's power and the influence of the established church.
Interesting. And the third beast in Revelation?
The red beast. This one's interpreted as the Persian Empire.
Persia. Okay.
Its 7 heads represent different dynasties. The 6th head is seen as the Parthians, who were in power during Jesus' time, and the 7th as the later Sasanian Empire.
And it also had horns.
10 horns, yes.
Sure.
Interpreted as the last 10 Sasanian kings who fight against the early Muslim community.
Okay, so we have beasts representing Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, the established church. Quite a pattern. Now, how does the Quran fit in?
The source points to Surah An-Naml, which mentions a beast from the earth, Dabiq min al-ard.
Same phrase as the earth beast in Revelation, essentially.
Very similar. And interestingly, this Quranic beast is said to speak to those who disbelieved.
Speak. Like the sea beast in Revelation spoke blasphemies.
Exactly. The source draws that parallel. The sea beast's speech indicated divine wrath on the Israelites around 6670 CE. This Quranic beast speaking is seen as a similar warning, initially directed at the Quraysh in Mecca.
But the punishment didn't happen then.
No, the source notes it was postponed because the Quraysh eventually converted to Islam, but the function of the speaking beast as a sign of judgment remains.
All right. So with all that context, beasts as empires in Daniel, Revelation, even the Quran, how does the source interpret the beast of the earth mentioned in the Hadith?
Following that established pattern, the Hadith's beast of the earth is interpreted as another major, powerful land-based empire, contrasting it, perhaps, with the sea-based Roman Empire.
And does the source identify a specific historical empire for this beast?
It does, and it's a big one. It links the beast of the earth to the Mongol Empire of the 13th century.
The Mongol Empire?
Yeah.
Wow. Why them?
Think about it. Their characteristics fit the description of a powerful land-based entity. Massive conquests across Asia, deep into Europe, unparalleled land power.
And known for brutality, too.
Exactly. Their sheer brutality and the immense global impact they had. The source even includes an image showing the Mongol Empire at its peak in 1279. The sheer scale really drives home the idea of a dominating land beast.
That's a powerful connection. Okay, so the Mongol Empire is the beast. What's the next major sign?
The next one is the rising of the sun from the west.
Now, that sounds incredibly literal, like the sun actually reversing course.
It does sound literal, but again, the source leans towards a symbolic interpretation here. Think about the phrase, the sun rising on a civilization.
Meaning its beginning, its ascendance.
Precisely. Its rise to prominence, its influence dawning on the world. So the sun rising from the west is interpreted as the rise and eventual dominance of Western civilization.
Western civilization.
Yeah.
Okay. When does the source say this sunrise began?
It points back quite far, actually, to the 12th century medieval Renaissance in Europe.
The 12th century, not the later Renaissance.
That's seen as the start. The intellectual awakening, rediscovering Greek and Arabic knowledge, scholastic philosophy, the first universities, advances in law, science, architecture.
So the foundations were laid then.
Right. Then came the later Renaissance and Reformation, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, all building on that, leading ultimately to the West's global dominance, especially after World War I.
And how does this connect back to the beast of the earth, the Mongol Empire?
The interpretation presented is quite interesting regarding the timing. It suggests the sun rising from the west, this rise of Western influence, was actually the first of these major signs to be fulfilled.
Before the beast.
Yes. The intellectual and cultural shift began, then came the emergence of the beast of Mongol Empire in the 13th century. So a shift in knowledge and power dynamics precedes the rise of that specific land empire.
Is there a warning associated with these signs appearing?
Absolutely. A very stark one in the Hadith. It says that once the sun rises from the west, or once the beast appears, or the Dajjal, faith will no longer benefit anyone who hadn't already believed.
So, a point of no return, in a sense.
That's the implication. A call to embrace faith before these major world-altering signs become undeniable.
Okay. That brings us to the next major sign, the Dajjal arrival of the false messiah.
The Dajjal, yes.
Well, name itself, Dajjal. What does it mean?
It literally means the great liar or the deceiver, and he's often called El-Masih al-Dajjal, the false messiah.
False messiah. So to understand that, we need to understand what messiah means first.
Exactly. In ancient Israel, messiah simply meant anointed one. It could refer to kings, priests, prophets, people chosen by God for a task.
But it evolved over time.
It did. It gradually took on the meaning of a specific future savior figure, someone who would bring deliverance and restore Israel.
So the Dajjal is a counterfeit savior.
That's the core idea. He'll present himself as the answer, the deliverer everyone's waiting for, playing on that deep human desire for rescue.
But he's false. How is that indicated?
The source emphasizes a key detail from the Hadith. The word kafir, meaning disbeliever or denier of God, will be written on his forehead, visible to believers.
Kafir on his forehead. So his promises are empty, no divine backing.
Precisely. He offers salvation, but it's entirely godless.
How does this Dajjal figure compare to the beast of the earth we discussed, the Mongol Empire interpretation?
It's a different kind of entity. The beast represents raw power, conquest, a massive physical empire. The Dajjal, according to the Hadith descriptions, appears in human form.
Human form, like Daniel's vision where the Babylonian lion became human.
Similar symbolic shift, perhaps.
Yeah.
It suggests that Dajjal isn't just about military might, but represents a state or system based on beliefs, misleading beliefs, false promises, deception through ideology, not just force.
Okay. Now, identifying this Dajjal, the source looks at events before his arrival.
Yes, it highlights 4 specific, significant events in Muslim history. These are presented as milestones in Muslim-Christian interactions and also as major trials for the Muslim community, the Ummah, kind of like signposts on the road to the Dajjal.
What's the first event?
The Battle of Yarmuk in 636 CE.
Yarmuk. That was Muslims against the Byzantines, right?
Exactly. The Byzantine Roman Empire. The Hadith describes it as a massive confrontation in Syria. Intense fighting over 6 days, 4 being particularly severe.
And the Muslims won decisively.
They did. The Hadith mentions the role of swift cavalry, including a figure named Ikrimah ibn Amijal and his death squad of 400 men. Heavy casualties, but it led to Muslim dominance in Syria, a major turning point.
Okay, event 1, Yarmuk. What's the second?
The Battle of Antioch, during the First Crusade in 1098 CE.
Crusades, right?
This is framed in the context of the Byzantines asking for Western help against the Seljuk Turks, and the Crusaders aiming to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy sites.
And the battle itself.
The Crusader army marched through an area called Amaq. The Muslim army, led by Kerboga from Mosul, camped near Dabiq before Antioch. The Hadith mentions 3 groups of Muslims then.
3 groups.
Yes. Those who fled the battle, Allah will never forgive them, it says. Those who were martyred, considered the best martyrs. And a third group, described as never being put to trial.
Never put to trial. Who were they?
The source interprets this third group as Turkic Muslims who weren't involved in that particular phase of the Crusades. The loss of Antioch was a significant blow to the Muslims at the time.
Okay, so Yarmuk, then Antioch, the third event.
The conquest of Constantinople by the Muslims in 1453 CE.
The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans?
Yes. This is interpreted as representing those Turkic Muslims, the ones not put to trial earlier, finally achieving this major victory over the Byzantine capital. A huge symbolic and strategic win.
And the fourth event leading up to the Dajjal.
The fall of the Ottoman Empire itself after World War I around 1918 CE.
The end of the Caliphate.
Exactly. The moment the Ottoman Caliphate surrendered to the Allied forces. This is presented as the final major historical marker before the Dajjal's emergence. These 4 events, spanning centuries, are seen as a connected chain.
So after these 4 big events, the Hadith describes a more immediate sequence leading to the Dajjal.
Yes, a specific chain of events. It starts with an image. Swords hung on olive trees.
Swords on olive trees. What does that symbolize?
The source interprets this as the Ottomans' surrender in the Armistice of Mudros in October 1918, hanging up the swords, ending the fight.
Okay, makes sense. What comes next?
The division of spoils.
Spoils of war.
Pretty much. This is seen as the Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, Greece, carving up the former Ottoman territories and resources among themselves after the war. Mandates, occupations, resource control.
Right. Then the Hadith mentions something quite dramatic, Satan crying out.
Yes, Satan cried out, "The Messiah has entered your homes."
The Messiah. But it's Satan saying it.
Exactly. It's interpreted as a false alarm, a deception. The source links this to the rise of communism as a global ideology around 1920.
Communism as the false Messiah.
That's the idea. Communism arrives, taking over places like Azerbaijan, Armenia, former Ottoman lands, promising liberation, a kind of worldly salvation, a false Messiah entering people's homes and lives.
Wow, okay. What follows that? Muslims reaching Syria.
This is linked to the formal implementation of the post-war division, specifically the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which put many former Ottoman territories, including Syria, under the control of the European Christian victors.
So the victors physically occupying the land.
Right. Then the Hadith says, Muslims line up for war.
Lining up for war, a new conflict.
Interpreted as the political maneuvering and formation of the new Turkish Republic. The Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished by the Turkish National Assembly in November 1922. Turkey was preparing to defend its new identity and borders.
And then comes the appearance of the Dajjal.
Yes. According to this interpretation, The appearance of the Dajjal aligns directly with the establishment of the Soviet Union in December 1922.
The Soviet Union, so that's the source's identification of the Dajjal.
That's the core identification, yes. Yeah. A new, powerful, atheistic ideology and state appearing on the world stage right after this sequence of events.
The Hadith also mentions 10 horsemen sent out by the Muslims when they hear about the Dajjal.
Right, a vanguard. The source interprets these 10 horsemen symbolically.
Not literal horsemen.
No, but as representing 10 key leaders of the Turkish national movement. Figures like Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Yusuf Kemal Tengirşenk, Kazım Karabekir, İsmet İnönü.
What did they do?
They played a crucial role in navigating this incredibly complex period. First, they actually sought and received aid from the emerging communists, the Dajjal figure, in 1921 to fight against the Western powers.
They allied with the Dajjal, temporarily.
In a strategic sense, yes. But crucially, the source emphasizes they maintained Turkey's ideological independence. They didn't become communist. Then, they skillfully negotiated with the Western powers.
Cheating too.
The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. This treaty granted Turkey full sovereignty, recognizing its new borders and preventing it from being carved up like other Ottoman territories. A major diplomatic victory attributed to these horsemen.
Okay, that's a fascinating interpretation. There's another detail. 70,000 of the Banu Ishaq attacking a city by the sea.
Yes, another very specific prophecy. The city is described as having one side facing the land and one side facing the sea.
And the source connects this to
Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, located right on the Caspian Sea, fits the geographical description.
Okay, and the Banu Ishaq, the children of Isaac.
Interpreted symbolically as Shia Muslims. They trace their lineage to Abraham, like Jews and Christians, Isaac's line, but represent a distinct religious identity formed after the Prophet Muhammad.
Shia Muslims of Baku, and 70,000.
Taken as an approximation of the Shia population in Baku, around that time, early 20th century.
And they take the city. The Hadith mentions specific phrases.
Yes, taking it with 3 cries of La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar. There is no God but Allah. Allah is the greatest. The source links this to the Takbirat, recited during the Eid al-Adha festival.
When did this happen?
On September 15th, 1918, which was Eid al-Adha that year. This was the day Ottoman forces entered Baku after the British and Armenian forces who had been holding it withdrew.
So the timing matches Eid and the opening of the city.
Seen as the return of the exiled leadership of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, representing the local Shia population, who established their government in Baku on September 17th, 1918, the 3rd day of Eid.
Okay, and the spoils they divide.
Interpreted as Baku's vast oil reserves, which came under the temporary control of this new Shia Muslim leadership.
But then the Hadith says they hear news of the Dajjal and have to leave.
Right. This aligns with April 1920, when Bolshevik communist forces, the Dajjal, advanced on Baku, forcing the leadership of the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic to flee into exile once again. The sequence seems to match the Hadith narrative quite closely.
It's incredibly detailed. Okay, one last point in this section. A Hadith summarizing conquests before the Dajjal.
Yes, a concise Hadith that mentions the sequence. Muslims will conquer Arabia, then Persia, then Rome, and then they will fight the Dajjal.
And the source sees a historical timeline here.
Exactly. Conquest of Arabia around 633 CE. Persia fully conquered by 651 CE. Rome, meaning the Byzantine Empire, conquered with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 CE. And finally, the defeat of the Dajjal.
Which is the source links to?
The defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and its subsequent collapse in 1991. That's seen as the fulfillment of fighting and defeating the Dajjal.
So putting it all together, the source makes a strong case for identifying the Dajjal with the Soviet Union, this atheistic, powerful state that emerged in 1922.
That's the central argument, yes. It sees the Soviet Union, or communism more broadly perhaps, as fulfilling the roles of both a false prophet and a false messiah.
How so? A false prophet?
By claiming ultimate authority, moral superiority, and demanding total allegiance, essentially acting as a messenger of an anti-divine ideology, like the false prophet figure in Revelation working for the beast. Communism's explicit promotion of atheism and materialism, its denial of God, its attack on traditional values.
The source included an image of verses from the International Right.
Yes, showing the explicit atheism. No savior from on high delivers. We must ourselves decide our duty. That captures the false prophet aspect, claiming truth while denying God.
And the false messiah aspect.
That ties into the promises. Communism offered a seemingly utopian vision, equality, justice, an end to oppression, a worker's paradise on earth.
A kind of secular salvation.
Exactly. It's a false promise of deliverance, exploiting genuine grievances against capitalism and inequality, but ultimately leading to violent revolution, class warfare, immense suffering, and the explicit rejection of divine guidance. A deceptive utopia.
The source also tackles the duration of the Dajjal's reign, the 40 days mentioned in Hadith. How does it interpret that? It's not literal days, is it?
No, not literal days. It's interpreted as a kind of mathematical puzzle, a symbolic timeline. The 40 days are broken down into distinct periods.
Okay.
One day is said to be like a year, another day like a month, another day like a week, and the rest are like normal days. The source interprets this slightly differently, but follows the idea of unequal periods. It suggests one period represents 7 years, the next represents 30 years, and the final period represents 38 years.
7, 30, and 38 years. How are these linked to the Soviet Union?
It maps the Montecific eras. The first period, 7 Islamic years, is linked to the revolutionary beginning under Lenin.
Lenin's era.
Right. Starting from Lenin's return to Russia after the February 1917 revolution, which was Jamadi al-Thani 1335 AH, and ending with his death in Jamadi al-Thani 1342 AH, exactly 7 Islamic years later. This covers the revolution and founding of the state.
Okay, the first 7 years, then the 30 years.
That period is linked to the rise of Stalin and his era of consolidation and power. It ends with Stalin's death in Jamadi al-Thani 1372 AH, which is 30 Islamic years after Lenin's death.
Stalin's reign, consolidation, industrialization, but also terror.
Exactly. The Soviet Union becomes a global superpower, but under immense oppression.
And the final 38 years.
This period covers the post-Stalin era up to the effective end of Communist Party monopoly. It starts after Stalin's death and ends, according to the source's calculation using the Islamic calendar, around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, specifically pinpointing Jamadi al-Thani 1410 AH, which aligns with early 1990.
The fall of the wall symbolizing the beginning of the end.
Yes, 38 Islamic years after Stalin's death. This period saw communism spread, but also face internal failures, economic stagnation, nationalism, Cold War pressures, leading to its eventual collapse, which happened formally in 1991, shortly after this 38-year period concluded. So the 40 days map onto the rise, peak, and fall.
That's a very specific timeline. The Hadith also mentions there will be many Dajjals, around 30.
Yes, approximately 30.
Yeah.
How does the source interpret the plural?
It interprets these other Dajjals symbolically as the various communist states that emerged around the world during the 20th century, inspired by or allied with the main Dajjal, the Soviet Union. So Cuba, China, Vietnam, Eastern Bloc countries.
Presumably, yes. The map provided highlights countries with significant communist influence. Some were short-lived, some merged into the USSR, approximately allows for that variation. North Korea is mentioned as a remaining example.
Okay, let's talk about the Dajjal's specific characteristics mentioned in the Hadith. First, the word kafir written on his forehead.
We touched on this. Like the blasphemous names on the Roman sea beast, this signifies an open, undeniable rejection of God. The forehead is prominent. It's not hidden.
So communism's open atheism.
Exactly. It's bold promotion of scientific atheism. It's persecution of religion. It wasn't subtle. The communist slogan image reinforces this blatant denial of faith.
What about being one-eyed and having curly hair? These are striking physical descriptions.
Again, interpreted symbolically. One-eyedness is seen as representing communism's narrow, materialistic focus, obsessed with a classless, stateless society, while being blind to human spiritual needs, divine guidance, and the complexities of human interdependence. This limited vision led to failures and destruction.
A kind of ideological tunnel vision.
You could say that. And the curly hair, often seen as a sign of ugliness or awkwardness in some traditions. Here it's interpreted as symbolizing the unnatural, distorted nature of communist societies, the forced conformity, the lack of freedom and expression, the closed-off, controlled environment, the socio-political repression, physical flaws representing ideological flaws.
Where does the Hadith say the Dajjal will emerge from?
From the east. Specifically, appearing in the land between Syria and Iraq.
Between Syria and Iraq.
Historically, that region was a contested border zone between the Byzantine, Roman, and Sasanian Persian empires. Emerging there suggests that Dajjal is independent of those pre-existing major powers.
And from the east.
Geographically, most of the Soviet Union, including the areas between historical Syria and Iraq, is east of Medina, the reference point. Plus, there's the whole Cold War symbolism, communism associated with the East versus the capitalist West.
Okay, another very specific detail. 70,000 Jewish followers from Isfahan wearing shawls, Taylor said.
Right. This is interpreted in a fascinating way. Not literally Isfahan in Persia.
No, where then?
The source points to Vilna, modern-day Vilnius in Lithuania, in the early 20th century.
Vilna. Why Vilna?
Vilna was known as the Jerusalem of the North. A major center of Jewish learning, culture, and religious leadership, much like Isfahan, was historically significant in Persia during the Prophet's time. It draws a parallel based on prominence.
Okay. And the 70,000 followers.
The Jewish population of Vilna around the turn of the 20th century was roughly in that range, about 63,000 in 1897, growing towards 76,000 by 1901. It's seen as an approximation.
And their connection to the Dajjal, communism.
Vilna was a major hub for Jewish revolutionary movements, especially socialist and Marxist ideologies. The General Jewish Labor Bund, a key socialist organization, was founded in Vilna in 1897. Many Jews there were deeply involved in the push against the Tsarist regime, including the failed 1905 Russian Revolution. They were early adopters of these Dajjalic ideas, according to this view.
The shawls, the Tayalisa.
Interpreted symbolically. Not necessarily prayer shawls, but representing distinctive traditions and cultural identity. Just as a specific type of shawl might be known in Isfahan, the source links this to the strong Yiddish language and literary culture that thrived in Vilna, marking them as a distinct group embracing this new ideology.
That's quite a reinterpretation of the geographical and demographic details.
It is. It relies heavily on symbolic parallels rather than literal readings.
Okay, let's shift to how Muslims interact with the Dajjal in these prophecies. The Hadith mentions him camping outside Medina but being unable to enter.
Yes. Here, Medina isn't taken literally as the city.
What then?
It's interpreted symbolically as the entire Muslim world, the Ummah. And Syria, mentioned nearby in some accounts, represents the Christian world, as it was largely Byzantine Christian territory then.
So the Dajjal camps outside the Muslim world but focuses on the Christian world.
That's the interpretation. It aligns with the Soviet Union's relative lack of success in establishing deep communist roots across the core Muslim world, compared to its influence in Eastern Europe and elsewhere.
Did the Soviets try to engage with the Muslim world?
Yes. The source notes things like the Bolsheviks exposing the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1917, which carved up the Middle East, trying to appeal to anti-imperialist sentiment. They even participated in a Mecca Congress in 1926. These are seen as attempts to get close to Medina.
But it didn't work long term.
Ultimately, the inherent atheism of Soviet ideology clashed too strongly with the deeply religious nature of most Muslim societies, limiting its appeal and lasting influence. He couldn't truly enter Medina.
The Hadith also mentions 3 tremors shaking Medina, causing hypocrites and disbelievers to leave and join the Dajjal.
These tremors are interpreted not as literal earthquakes, but as major political and intellectual crises shaking the Muslim Ummah.
Like what?
The source identifies 3. First, the end of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1922, leaving Muslims politically fragmented and vulnerable. Second, the peak of European colonialism after WWII, with more Muslim lands occupied, increasing hardship and disillusionment. Third, the forceful annexation of Muslim-majority Central Asian countries into the Soviet Union itself.
And these crises led some Muslims towards communism.
Yes. Some were attracted by its anti-imperialist rhetoric and promises of equality, seeing it as an alternative to Western domination or traditional structures. Think of communist parties gaining traction in places like Afghanistan or South Yemen. These are the ones leaving Medina to join the Dajjal. But again, the atheism eventually alienated many.
There's also mention of a specific tribe, the Banu Tamim, resisting the Dajjal.
Yes, the Hadith praises the Banu Tamim for being steadfast against him. How is this interpreted?
The Banu Tamim are a prominent Arab tribe, historically based in areas of modern Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the Gulf. The source sees their resistance not as direct military confrontation with the Soviets, but as indirect resistance through upholding Islamic traditions, tribal values, and supporting religious counter-movements against atheism and materialism spreading in the Arab world. So, ideological resistance.
Exactly. It notes, for instance, that Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi reform movement, which strongly opposed external ideologies, was from the Banu Tamim. Their adherence to tradition was their shield against the Dajjal.
Okay, let's talk about the Dajjal's power. The Hadith says he can't really be controlled, and there's no benefit in trying to kill him directly.
This is interpreted as reflecting the nature of totalitarian communist states. Once established, they seemed incredibly powerful, rigid, almost invincible from within. Overthrowing them was extremely difficult and costly.
So the advice is, avoid direct confrontation.
The Hadith advises believers to essentially stay away, to flee from the Dajjal if possible. This is seen as practical advice when facing such an oppressive and seemingly unshakable system. Direct opposition was often futile and deadly.
And the Hadith stating that no trial greater than the trial of the Dajjal will occur between the time of Adam and the hour.
This is understood in terms of sheer scale and impact. At its peak, communism ruled over a third of the world's population. Billions lived under systems that actively suppressed religion, curtailed basic freedoms, and caused immense suffering. It was arguably one of the most widespread and intense periods of ideological oppression in history. A truly massive trial.
The Hadith also advises Muslims to seek refuge in mountains to escape his trials.
This echoes historical patterns of people fleeing persecution to remote areas to preserve their faith. Think of early Christians in Rome, or others finding refuge in mountainous regions like, the source mentions, the Abakan Mountains in Siberia, perhaps symbolizing any place of refuge from oppressive ideology.
And reciting Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18 of the Qur'an, for protection.
Surah Al-Kahf contains stories about faith tested, like the companions of the cave who slept for centuries to escape persecution. Reciting it is seen as a way to gain spiritual strength, insight, and resolve when facing overwhelming trials like the Dajjal, strengthening faith against his deceptions.
Finally, in this section, the Dajjal's paradise and hell. He offers paradise, but it's hell, and his fire is cool water.
A very potent metaphor. His paradise, the communist utopia of perfect equality and prosperity, is interpreted as being in reality a hellish existence for many, marked by oppression, poverty, and death, like the gulags, forced famines.
And his fire.
His fire, or hell, perhaps representing the perceived hardship and struggle of rejecting his system, or maybe even the perceived chaos of the capitalist world he opposed, is actually like cool water, potentially leading to true benefit or salvation. The source contrasts the devastation in communist states with the unprecedented economic growth and prosperity in many capitalist societies during the same period. Choose the fire. Reject the false paradise.
It's a powerful inversion. Okay, let's get into the specific events associated with the Dajjal in the Hadith. First, he provides sustenance, makes rainfall, etc., and people believe in him.
This is linked to the early, seemingly successful period of the Soviet Union, especially the rapid industrialization under the first five-year plan, 1928-1932.
How so?
The state seemed to be performing economic miracles. Factories sprung up, harvests were collectivized, initially promising abundance. Propaganda portrayed limitless progress. People bought into the system, some with almost religious fervor, like the Stakhanovite movement, glorifying superhuman workers. The Dajjal seemed to be delivering on his promises of prosperity.
But then, the Hadith says people will reject his call, and he'll afflict them with famine and poverty.
This finds a chilling parallel, according to the source, in the resistance to collectivization, particularly in Ukraine. Peasants resisted giving up their land and grain.
And the state's reaction.
Brutal suppression. Confiscation of all food supplies, blockades preventing aid, deliberate starving of the population to break their resistance. This led directly to the Holodomor, the man-made famine of 1932-1933, which killed millions, exactly like the Dajjal, punishing those who reject him with drought and famine.
Horrifying. Next, the Dajjal commands the earth to bring forth its treasures from barren lands.
This is interpreted as the Soviet state, having solidified its control, exploiting the vast natural resources of previously undeveloped or barren regions, Siberia, Central Asia, the Urals.
True.
Through massive industrial projects, often using forced labor from the gulags during the second five-year plan, 1933-1937 and beyond, extracting minerals, timber, oil, the treasures from desolate lands, all accumulating under state control, like the Dajjal commanding the earth wealth.
Okay. The final and perhaps most complex event. The Dajjal kills a young believer, brings him back to life, but then fails to kill him again.
Yes, a very dramatic encounter. The source offers a highly detailed symbolic interpretation, connecting this directly to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan.
Afghanistan as the believer.
Yes. Medina again represents the wider Muslim Ummah. The believer emerging from it is Afghanistan. The Dajjal is the Soviet Union, and the Dajjal's soldiers or followers are the communist factions within Afghanistan itself, specifically Parcham and Kalk.
Okay, walk us through the sequence. The believer confronts the Dajjal.
First, the believer challenges the Dajjal, refusing to acknowledge him as Lord. This is linked to Afghan President Dukhan turning against his former communist allies and purging the Parcham faction from his government in 1977, rejecting the Dajjal's influence.
Then the Dajjal orders his followers to kill the believer.
The Hadith says the Dajjal's followers seize the believer. This is interpreted as the rival communist faction, launching the violent Sao Revolution in April 1978, overthrowing and killing Daud Khan and taking power. Their subsequent brutal repression even surprised their Soviet backers.
Then the Dajjal kills the believer and brings him back to life. He saws him in two in the Hadith.
The source interprets this killing and reviving as the Soviet Union's direct intervention in December 1979. They were unhappy with the cult leader, Hafizullah Amin. Operation Storm 333 assassinated Amin, killing the believer state led by him, and installed the leader of the other communist faction, Parcham's Babrak Karmal, reviving the believer state under new communist control. A dramatic shift orchestrated by the Dajjal.
And after reviving him, the Dajjal asks again, "Do you believe I am your Lord?" And the believer says, "Now I am even more certain about you."
Yes, the revived believer is even more defiant. This represents the Afghan people's resistance, the Mujahideen fighting back against the Soviet occupation and the puppet communist government. Their resolve strengthened by the blatant Soviet interference.
And the Dajjal tries to kill him again but fails. His neck turns to copper in the Hadith.
Exactly. The Dajjal cannot harm him further. This symbolizes the Soviet Union's failure to crush the Afghan resistance despite a decade of brutal war. The neck turning to copper represents the intensity and ultimate futility of their military efforts. The Soviets couldn't win.
So that Dajjal casts him away.
Which corresponds to the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. They gave up, unable to subdue the believer.
But the Hadith says the believer is the greatest martyr. What about his fate?
The source links the believer's eventual martyrdom and entering paradise to the aftermath, the collapse of the communist government in Afghanistan in 1992, and the tragic civil war that followed. The martyrdom symbolizes the sincerity of those mujahideen who fought against the Soviet Dajjal, seeing it as a righteous struggle against atheism and oppression.
That's an incredibly intricate mapping of the prophecy onto 20th century history.
It really is. Highly specific.
Now, the source anticipates objections to this whole Dajjal Soviet Union interpretation, right? What about the famous story of Tamim al-Dari?
Yes. The companion of the prophet who claimed he met the Dajjal, chained on an island. A very well-known hadith.
How does the source address that? It seems to contradict the Dajjal appearing only in 1922.
It interprets Tamim al-Dari's experience as a vision, not a literal physical encounter.
Why a vision?
Several reasons are given. 1, there are no corroborating accounts from anyone else on the ship with Tamim. 2, the prophet himself stated that everyone alive in his time would be dead within 100 years, which would include Tamim, making a centuries-long chain Dajjal problematic. 3, it parallels the prophet's own reported vision of the Dajjal, so a symbolic vision, not proof of a literal contemporary Dajjal.
Okay. What about Ibn Sayyad, the Jewish boy in Medina during the prophet's time whom many suspected was the Dajjal?
Another common point. The source argues against Ibn Sayyad being the Dajjal based on the prophet's own words. The prophet said if the Dajjal appeared in his lifetime, he, the prophet, would confront him. Since Ibn Sayyad lived then, and the prophet didn't definitively identify or confront him as the Dajjal, he couldn't be the one.
Any other reasons?
Yes. The prophet also said the Dajjal would not be able to enter Mecca or Medina. But historical accounts show Ibn Sayyad traveled freely between Medina and Mecca. So the details don't match the major signs prophesied for the actual Dajjal.
So if he wasn't literal then, why did the prophet and his companions seem to treat the Dajjal as a potential contemporary human threat?
The source explains this by the nature of prophecy and visions. Prophets report what they see in visions accurately, without necessarily adding layers of interpretation unless given by God. The vision was of a figure appearing human-like.
So they described what they saw.
Exactly. Without a specific divine interpretation saying this human figure represents a future atheistic state, the natural assumption for the companions would be that he was indeed a human being who might appear soon. Full understanding, the source argues, often only comes when the prophecy is actually fulfilled.
That makes sense. Okay, moving on from the Dajjal, the next major sign. Gog and Magog, or Ya'juj and Ma'juj.
Yes. Figures mentioned across the scriptures, Bible, Qur'an, Hadith. The Qur'an explicitly links their release to the signs of the hour.
Where do they come from? The source looks at their history.
It does. Starting with the Old Testament. In Genesis, Magog is a descendant of Japheth, Noah's son, traditionally associated with northern peoples, the white nations.
And in prophecy?
The prophet Ezekiel speaks of a future battle where God defeats a large coalition led by Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, coming from the uttermost parts of the north. This is often linked geographically to areas around the Black Sea.
Does the source connect this prophecy to any specific historical event?
It suggests a possible early partial fulfillment related to the Seleucid Greek king Antiochus V Epiphanes.
The one who desecrated the temple.
Yes, in 167 BCE, that act led to the Maccabean revolt and the temple's restoration. The source notes that the Seleucids recruited mercenaries from Central Asian and Black Sea tribes. Perhaps these groups, led by a figure like Gog, were involved, fulfilling aspects of Ezekiel's prophecy around that time.
Interesting. What about the Quranic account?
Surah Al-Kahf mentions Gog and Magog as a force causing corruption. A figure named Dul-Qarnayn builds a great barrier to contain them.
Dul-Qarnayn, sometimes identified with Cyrus the Great.
That's a common identification, yes. Linking him potentially to the Ottoman Empire, the two-horned ram in Daniel's vision. The source suggests this Quranic story might refer to a more localized historical event, perhaps a barrier built in the Caucasus Mountains against specific northern tribes, and that this barrier is now considered broken or irrelevant.
So the Quranic account is more about them being contained historically.
Initially, yes. But the source also notes an evolution, from Gog of the land of Magog in Ezekiel to just Gog and Magog as a collective entity in the New Testament and the Quran. This might signify a shift from a specific leader place to a broader population or civilization.
Do other historical texts mention them?
Yes. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus linked Magog to the Scythians, nomads north of the Black Sea. Later, the 12th-century Muslim geographer Ali Drizi associated them with northern Germania. These consistently point north of the Mediterranean world.
So where does the source ultimately place their lineage? Who are Gog and Magog today, according to this view?
It connects them to the peoples of northern and western Europe.
How?
Through the Yamnaya culture, from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, north of Black Caspian Seas, around 3300–2500 BCE. These people are seen as potential descendants of Japheth and the likely originators of Indo-European languages.
And they spread west.
Yes, their genetic and cultural influence spread across Europe. Later, the Germanic tribes, who emerged from these roots, played a massive role during the migration period, around 300 to 800 CE, shaping modern European populations: Saxons, Franks, Goths, Vandals, Vikings. These northern and western European peoples are identified as the likely descendants of Gog and Magog.
Okay, so if Gog and Magog are the peoples of northern and western Europe, how does the source interpret their emergence as a sign of the end times?
It equates their emergence with the era of European colonialism and global domination, roughly from the 16th to the 20th centuries.
How does that fit the prophecies?
Well, the Book of Revelation depicts Gog and Magog being gathered by Satan for war after the 1,000 years are over. The source interprets the 1,000 years symbolically, starting from the time of Prophet Muhammad, who had titles like Faithful and True. 1,000 years after him brings us roughly to the start of the major European expansion.
And they come from the four corners of the earth.
Seen as representing the relatively remote and inaccessible regions of northern and western Europe from the perspective of the Middle East during the Middle Ages, Satan deceiving them is interpreted as the pride and greed that drove European nations to colonize and exploit the globe. The source lists the major colonial powers, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, etc., as the embodiment of Gog and Magog emerging.
Revelation also says they besieged the camp of the saints and the beloved city, Mecca and Medina.
Yes. The source connects this to the situation after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, when European colonial powers controlled almost all the land surrounding Mecca and Medina, Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Iraq, the Gulf states under British influence, Syria, Lebanon under French control. The holy cities themselves remained protected, but they were effectively surrounded, besieged by Gog and Magog's power.
What about the Quranic description? Surah Al-Anbiya says they will swarm down from every height.
Interpreted militarily, height is seen as representing strategic advantage, military superiority. European nations achieved this through technological advancements, guns, cannons, powerful navies, allowing them to dominate other civilizations. They swarmed down from a position of power.
And the Hadith about the barrier.
The Hadith mentioning the hole in Dul-Qarnayn's barrier widening in the Prophet's time is seen as a symbolic indication of their imminent release and eventual emergence during this colonial era.
So emergence equals colonial expansion. What about the clash of Gog and Magog? Does the source link that to a specific event too?
It does. A massive one, World War II.
World War II as the clash of Gog and Magog.
Yes. The descriptions in the Quran and Hadith of Gog and Magog turning on each other just before the hour are seen as vividly matching the intra-European conflict of WWII, where the nations of Gog and Magog, northern Western Europe, fought furiously among themselves.
Where does the Quran describe this?
Surah Al-Kahf, the same chapter that mentions the barrier, says that on that day, interpreted as the final era, Allah will leave them surging against each other in waves right before the trumpet is blown. This surging against each other fits the total multi-front warfare of WWII.
And Surah Al-Anbiya mentions their emergence is followed closely by the true promise, the hour.
Right, linking their emergence and clash directly to the final events. The Hadith suggesting a brief period of prosperity after their clash, but before the trumpet is interpreted as the post-WWII pre-final judgment period we might be in now.
Okay, so the general clash is WWII. Does the source connect specific Hadith details about Gog and Magog's final campaign to WWII events?
Yes, quite specifically, linking them primarily to the actions of Nazi Germany.
Yeah, so
The Hadith says Allah will send them forth, Yabathu Allah, distinct from the earlier opening Futihat of the barrier. This final sending forth is aligned with Nazi Germany's sudden, aggressive, blitzkrieg-style expansion at the start of WWII, a final, decisive unleashing.
Okay. What about drinking the water of Lake Tiberias, Sea of Galilee?
Lake Tiberias was a vital water source for the Byzantine Christians. Symbolically, this is interpreted as the Nazis draining crucial resources: oil, food, industrial materials from the occupied lands, particularly those with Christian populations. The immense demands of the Nazi war machine depleted these resources, like drinking a lake dry.
And reaching Jerusalem, shooting arrows at the sky.
The Hadith says they reach near Jerusalem, boast of conquering earth and now wanting to conquer heaven, shoot arrows skyward, and the arrows return bloodstained.
How is that interpreted?
Nazi Germany's early victories bred immense hubris. The bloodstained arrows symbolize their violent attacks on religion itself. Jerusalem is sacred to Jews and Christians, both heavily persecuted by the Nazis, clergy killed, synagogues destroyed, the Holocaust, Jehovah's Witnesses imprisoned, churches controlled. The Nazis promoted their own ideology of racial superiority and occultism, actively trying to eliminate traditional faiths, killing those in heaven.
And the end of Gog and Magog in the Hadith, worms attacking their necks.
Allah sends worms, nahaf, that attack their necks, and they die instantly, as one person. This isn't literal worms, but an analogy for Nazi Germany's downfall.
Worms as
Small, internal, but pervasive factors that destroy the regime from within. Overextension, mismanagement, logistical failures, partisan resistance, allied bombing, degrading infrastructure and morale, leadership failures. Multiple small things combining to cause a sudden collapse. Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945 saw the simultaneous death of the Nazi war machine on all fronts.
So WWII serves as both the clash and the end of Gog and Magog in this framework?
The end of their major prophesied military campaign, yes.
What about the objection that some hadiths seem to place the Dajjal's defeat before the Gog and Magog episode? Sahih Muslim, for example.
The source addresses this by explaining it as a common feature of parallel narratives in Scripture. Events that happen concurrently are sometimes presented sequentially, ordered by theme or importance rather than strict chronology.
So the Dajjal Soviet Union, 1922-1991, and the Gog and Magog clash, WWII, involving Nazi Germany, were overlapping historical periods.
Exactly. They occurred partly concurrently, even though the Hadith might narrate the end of one before describing the end of the other. It's seen as narrative structure, not a strict timeline contradiction.
Okay. This brings us to the final major sign discussed in detail: the descent of Jesus, peace be upon him, the arrival of the true Messiah.
Right. Now, this sign, Jesus descending from the sky, is mentioned prominently in Hadith, but notably not explicitly in the Qur'an.
And the source interprets this symbolically, too.
Yes, consistent with the approach to other signs like the beast or the Dajjal. Jesus' descent isn't seen as a literal return of the person, but as the emergence of a state or power that embodies certain messianic qualities.
A state acting like a savior, like the Babylonian Empire ending as a human figure in Daniel.
Similar idea. This Messiah state plays a decisive role in the great conflict involving Gog and Magog, WWII, the European powers fighting each other, and also stands against the Dajjal, the false Messiah of the Soviet Union.
And which state does the source identify in this role?
The United States of America.
The USA as the symbolic return of Jesus.
That's the interpretation offered. The U.S. stepping onto the world stage, playing a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany, Gog and Magog's clash, and then leading the opposition to the Soviet Union, the Dajjal, throughout the Cold War fits the function described for the returning Jesus in the Hadith narrative.
What specific functions?
The Hadith says Jesus will fight and defeat the Dajjal and confront Gog and Magog. The source argues the U.S. fulfilled these roles symbolically during WWII in the Cold War. It emphasizes that the scope of Jesus' return in Hadith is primarily these conflicts, so the symbolic interpretation should focus there. Without the U.S.'s intervention, the source argues, the outcome of those global struggles would have been vastly different.
So not a literal second coming, but a geopolitical force acting in that prophesied role?
Precisely.
Now, the source also explicitly presents arguments against the literal physical descent of Jesus, right?
Okay.
It mentions the scholar Javed Ahmad Ghamidi.
Yes, it delves into this quite significantly, aiming to show why a symbolic interpretation might be preferred, though stating the goal isn't to definitively prove one over the other. Ghamidi's arguments from the Qur'an are central.
What are those arguments?
The main point is the Qur'an's silence. Ghamidi argues the Qur'an details Jesus' life meticulously: birth, miracles, plots against him, his death, ascension to God, even his role on Judgment Day, but never mentions a return to earth before the final hour. Such a major event, he argues, would surely be mentioned if it were literal doctrine.
The Qur'an mentions his death and ascension.
Clearly. Surah Al-Ma'idah also quotes Jesus speaking on Judgment Day, saying he only told people to worship God and that God was witness over them while he was among them. But after God took him up, tawafatani, often meaning death or completion, he didn't know what they did.
Implying he wasn't back on Earth to see later developments.
That's the argument. Some say this only refers to people during his original lifetime. But Ghamidi points out that major deviations like the deification of Mary formalized at the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE happened long after his ascension. If Jesus knew nothing of what Christians did after God took him, it implies he didn't return.
Are there other scholars who question the literal descent?
Yes, the source lists quite a few prominent Islamic scholars throughout modern history who expressed skepticism or reinterpreted the Hadith.
Oh, such as?
People like Maulana Muhammad Hassan and Maulana Ubaidullah Sindi, who suggested some Hadith might be influenced by Jewish traditions or even fabricated. Allama Mahmud Chaltut, a former Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, critically examined their authenticity. Maulana Shabir Ahmad Azhar Marathi and Kamar Ahmad Usmani argued it contradicts the finality of prophethood. Maulana Abu Kalam Azad said it could only be accepted if explicitly in the Quran. Even Allama Muhammad Iqbal viewed the concepts of Jesus' return and the Mahdi as influenced by non-Islamic sources.
So considerable scholarly debate exists around the literal interpretation.
Definitely. The article accepts the authenticity of the Hadith about Isa's descent, but reads them symbolically.
Exactly. The Hadith are valid, but the events they describe related to the end times are seen as metaphors for historical occurrences, not a literal physical return.
Okay, so let's dive into the symbolic interpretation. When does the article place the descent of Isa?
It links it to a specific point in the Dajjal narrative we discussed earlier, the story of the believer killed and revived by the Dajjal. The Hadith says the youth returns laughing, and at that point, Allah sends Isa, A.S.
Okay, connecting back to the Afghanistan-Soviet interpretation.
Not directly Afghanistan here. It connects the Dajjal killing, reviving more generally to communist revolutions, overthrowing old regimes and installing new ones. But the timing of Isa's descent is linked to the youth representing Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was formed after WWII. During WWII, it was invaded by Germany. The communist partisan movement grew strong. In November 1942, they formed AVNOJ, the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, essentially a communist-led government controlling parts of the country.
And what else happened in November 1942?
Crucially, the U.S. launched Operation Torch, its first major ground offensive of the war, landing in North Africa.
So the symbolic descent of Isa is linked to the U.S. entering the fight in a major way.
That's the interpretation. AVNOJ forming, a revival of sorts under communist influence linked to the Dajjal narrative, happened simultaneously with the U.S., representing Isa, the saving power, making its decisive entry into the European-African theater. November 1942 is pinpointed as this pivotal moment shifting the war's balance, seen as Isa's descent.
Okay. What about Isa refusing to lead the prayer when Muslims ask him to?
This hadith is interpreted through America's post-WWII policy shift. The U.S. began, at least rhetorically, supporting the independence of colonized nations.
Example.
The article cites the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. President Roosevelt met Sultan Mohammed V of Morocco. The Sultan expressed desire for independence, and Roosevelt apparently indicated future U.S. support, though not immediate action due to alliance with France.
So the U.S. encouraged self-determination.
Yes, aligning with principles in the Atlantic Charter 1941. Moroccan nationalists saw this as hopeful. ICE's refusal to lead prayer is interpreted as the U.S. encouraging Muslim nations to lead their own liberation struggles, with the U.S. playing a supportive, perhaps indirect role rather than taking direct leadership over them.
Interesting take. What about non-believers dying and ICE's breath having far-reaching effects?
Death of non-believers is seen symbolically as the defeat of Axis forces, those who didn't recognize or align with the coming U.S. power during Operation Torch. Many surrendered or were overcome. It wasn't just military. It marked the start of overwhelming U.S. global influence.
And the breath reaching everywhere.
Symbolizes the pervasive, far-reaching impact of American power, culture, and ideology across the globe after WWII. Its influence became inescapable.
Okay, there's a part about Gog and Magog gathering around Mount Tur where Isa takes refuge.
Right. Mount Tur, Sinai, is historically linked to Covenant Prophet Musa's AS Covenant. The article interprets Mount Tur here symbolically as the framework of Allied treaties, conferences, and strategies during WWII.
Like Yalta-Potsdam.
Exactly. Casablanca, unconditional surrender. Quebec, nuclear collaboration. Tehran, Second Front plans. Bretton Woods, post-war finance. Yalta and Potsdam, post-war order, Germany's division, UN. These agreements formed the mountain or fortress of Allied strategy.
And Gog and Magog surrounding it.
Represents the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany, part of Gog and Magog in this interpretation, aggressively expanding and eventually being encircled and besieged by the Allied forces operating under these agreements.
The Hadith mentions Isa and his companions praying to Allah on the mountain.
This is linked to American leadership invoking divine help during the war. The article gives examples like President Roosevelt's heartfelt radio address prayer on D-Day Eve in June 1944, praying for the troops' success and safety, and for liberation. Also, President Truman proclaiming a national day of prayer in August 1945 after victory.
So aligning national actions with seeking divine aid?
That's the connection made.
Then comes the aftermath.
Well,
Allah sends birds with necks like Bactrian camels to carry away the bodies of Gog and Magog, followed by cleansing rain.
Bactrian camels are known for being large, strong, resilient. The birds symbolizing this are interpreted as the massive, collective, international efforts after WWII.
Efforts like what?
Clearing war debris, massive humanitarian aid programs, the war crime trials, Nuremberg, Tokyo, establishing international law precedents against atrocities, dismantling Nazi ideology, bringing criminals to justice. It was a huge cleanup operation on a global scale.
And the rain that follows.
Symbolizes the cleansing away of the war's devastation and ideologies. It washes the earth, allowing for a fresh start, laying the foundation for the new post-war world order. Think of the Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe, the creation of the UN, IMF, World Bank institutions designed to foster peace and stability.
So renewal after destruction.
Precisely.
What about Isa abolishing the jizya tax?
Jizya was historically a tax paid by non-Muslims under Muslim rule. Isa abolishing it is interpreted symbolically as the establishment of the modern nation-state system, promoted heavily by the U.S. after WWII.
How does that connect?
The New World Order was based, in principle, on sovereign nation-states where all citizens ideally have equal rights and responsibilities, regardless of religion. This framework, championed by the U.S. through the UN Charter, indirectly led to the formal abolition of jizya in most Muslim-majority countries as they adopted national constitutions promoting citizenship equality.
So a shift towards secular national identity over religious identity for civic rights.
In essence, yes. That's the interpretation.
And wealth becoming abundant, so much so that no one accepts charity, tzedakah.
This is linked directly to the unprecedented global economic boom after WWII, especially in the U.S. and allied Western nations.
The post-war prosperity.
Yeah. Rise of consumerism, vastly increased standards of living for many. The article credits U.S. leadership, again, the Marshall Plan, institutions like GATT, leading to the WTO, the Bretton Woods system, IMF, World Bank, all designed to create stable, open global trade and prevent the economic conditions that led to war.
So the U.S., as ISA, fosters peace and prosperity.
That's the symbolic role assigned here. establishing justice, peace, and economic stability like a just ruler.
Okay. Isa performing tawaf, circumambulating the Kaaba.
This is interpreted symbolically, not literally. Tawaf around the Kaaba represents influence over the central sphere. It's seen as symbolizing the global leadership and influence exerted by the U.S. after WWII.
With the U.S. as Isa and the Soviets as the Dajjal.
Yes. The U.S., ISA, assumes global leadership, while the Soviet Union, Dajjal, constantly tries to challenge but ultimately fails to supplant U.S. dominance. The Tawaf signifies the U.S. maintaining its preeminent position in the global sphere of influence.
The Hadith sometimes mentions Isa being supported by two men during Tawaf.
The article suggests this could symbolize key strategic alliances, bolstering U.S. power during the Cold War, perhaps nations like Britain and West Germany providing critical political and military support.
What about Isa searching for the Dajjal?
This is interpreted as the U.S. actively monitoring, containing, and countering Soviet communist influence throughout the Cold War.
Like intelligence gathering, containment policy.
Yeah. Exactly. Identifying communist activities, assessing their strength, and using various means diplomatic, economic, military, covert to limit their spread. Think of interventions in Korea, Vietnam, or supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 80s. Actively searching out and fighting the Dajjal's influence.
Then the Dajjal melting upon seeing Isa and blood on Isa's spear.
The melting is interpreted as the gradual internal decay of the Soviet Union. It didn't collapse overnight. Economic failures, political repression, breeding discontent, ideological disillusionment, these factors were melting the system from within, arguably starting from the Cold War's beginning, accelerated by facing U.S. power, ISA.
And the blood on the spear.
This is specifically linked to the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan. The U.S.-backed Mujahideen inflicted a massive blow, economically draining, militarily humiliating, politically damaging. That defeat is seen as the blood on Isa's spear, a direct, visible wound inflicted on the Dajjal system via U.S. support for its opponents.
Finally, the killing of the Dajjal at Bab Lud, the Gate of Lud.
This is the climax. Lud, historically, was a significant town in Palestine, important defensively for Jerusalem, under Byzantine rule.
So a place of strategic importance.
Yes. The article equates Bab Lud symbolically with the Berlin Wall.
Why the Berlin Wall?
Because the wall was the central symbol and a key strategic pillar of the Soviet bloc's defense and control during the Cold War. And West Berlin, supported by the U.S. and its allies, was deliberately made a showcase of capitalist success right inside the communist sphere. This economic disparity became unsustainable for the East.
So the fall of the wall was the killing blow.
It's seen as the decisive moment. The Afghan War weakened the USSR internally, but the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 publicly exposed that weakness and triggered the rapid collapse of communism across Eastern Europe. That's the Dajjal being cornered and overcome at his symbolic gate.
So killing the Dajjal at Bab Lud, fall of the Berlin Wall, and its immediate consequences.
More precisely, the article links the killing to the formal end of the Communist Party's monopoly on power in the Soviet Union, which happened in early 1990, directly following the wall's fall. This ended the system established back in 1917-1922. The final disintegration of the USSR in December 1991 was the aftermath.
Wow. Okay, that maps the entire ISA narrative onto WWII and the Cold War, with the U.S. in the symbolic role of ISA and the USSR as the Dajjal.
A very comprehensive and consistent symbolic reading.
What about events after the Dajjal's death in the Hadith? There's mention of 7 years of peace.
Yes, a Hadith mentions 7 years when people live in peace after the Dajjal. The article notes some versions mention the Prophet's age here, but not the most reliable ones, like Bukhari and Muslim. It connects the 7-year period to the immediate post-Cold War era, roughly 1991, Soviet collapse, to 1998, a time when the U.S. was the sole superpower and there was a sense of relative global stability. The end of history idea was floated.
And the cold winds from Syria, mentioned in some hadith after the Dajjal's death.
Syria, in the Prophet's time, was under Byzantine Christian rule representing the West. So cold winds from Syria is interpreted as the pervasive influence of Western Christian civilization spreading globally after the fall of communism.
Cold winds usually aren't pleasant.
Well, in the Arabian desert context, a cool wind can be refreshing. The article suggests it represents the allure of Western culture, its freedoms, consumerism, technology, material progress reaching everywhere via globalization and the internet. But perhaps cold also hints at a potential downside, a decline in traditional faith and morals accompanying this influence. It's a nuanced symbol.
It's important to remember these interpretations link specific nations to these roles. Does the article address the ethics of, say, U.S. actions during this period?
Yes, it makes a point in clarifying this. It acknowledges that while the Hadith might indicate the roles certain states play in fulfilling prophecy, it doesn't mean every action taken by those states was ethically right or divinely endorsed.
So the U.S. playing the role of ISA doesn't mean everything the U.S. did was good.
Exactly. The article explicitly mentions ethically questionable U.S. actions, like the atomic bombings of Japan, bombing campaigns in Korea, or actions in Vietnam, even while acknowledging its role against fascism and communism. The prophetic role doesn't equal moral perfection.
And it touches on whether America acted consciously as a messiah figure.
It raises the question, was it self-interest or some sense of destiny? The article suggests historical events unfold through a complex mix of human intentions and perhaps a larger divine plan aligning with prophetic signs. The U.S. likely acted out of geopolitical and economic interests, but its actions, perhaps inadvertently, fulfilled this interpreted prophetic narrative.
Okay, we've covered Dajjal, Gog and Magog, Isa. What about the smoke sign?
Dukhan, another major sign. The article notes it's mentioned in Hadith, but without much detail, unlike the others, and not clearly in other scriptures.
But as a major sign, it should be significant.
Globally significant, yes. The interpretation links it to the modern environmental crisis caused by industrialization.
Air pollution.
Basically, yes. The massive increase in burning fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution has created widespread smoke, smog, and air pollution on an unprecedented scale. The article argues this pervasive, health-damaging, environment-degrading pollution affecting billions globally is the smoke sign mentioned in Hadith. It's a defining feature of our modern era.
That's a very contemporary interpretation. What about the three landslides? One in the east, one west, one in Arabia?
Again, interpreted symbolically, not necessarily as literal geological events. It draws a precedent from Scripture where natural disasters often symbolize social or political collapse.
So three major regional collapses. Where?
The article suggests East, Iraq, specifically the period around 2006 during the intense civil war following the 2003 U.S. invasion. Social fabric, infrastructure, political order disintegrated. West, Libya during the 2011 Arab Spring. Libya is historically linked to the West, Maghreb. The collapse of the Gaddafi regime led to state failure, economic ruin, ongoing conflict. Arabian Peninsula. Yemen, particularly from 2014 onwards with the escalation of the civil war, resulting in catastrophic humanitarian crisis, famine, collapse of healthcare, education rendering the land barren in terms of functioning society.
So, recent major collapses in the Muslim world.
That's the interpretation.
The rising of the sun from the west.
This is interpreted symbolically as the rise and eventual global dominance of Western civilization.
Not of literal astronomical event.
No, it sees this as a process starting perhaps with the Renaissance in the 12th century, accelerating through the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, and colonialism, culminating in the West's undeniable global superiority in science, technology, politics, military power, and cultural influence by the 20th century. The sun of power and knowledge rising from the West and dominating the globe.
The beast of the earth.
We discussed that earlier symbolic of oppressive states. It's listed as a major sign, reinforcing that interpretation.
Any other minor signs mentioned?
It touches on the Hadith about a slave girl giving birth to her mistress.
A strange one. How's it interpreted?
As representing major social upheaval and reversal of status. Specifically, it links it to the abolition of slavery globally, formalized by things like the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This condemned slavery and promoted equality, effectively meaning former slaves and their descendants gained freedom and equal rights, metaphorically giving birth to a generation no longer subordinate, perhaps even surpassing former masters in status or opportunity in some contexts.
A social transformation sign. Does the article discuss Imam Mahdi?
No, it explicitly states it doesn't cover the Mahdi because the narrations about him are not found in the two most rigorously authenticated Hadith collections, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which seem to be the primary source base for this particular article's interpretation of major signs.
Okay, one last sign.
Yeah.
The fire from Hijaz that illuminates camels in Busra.
Ah, this one is presented as having already occurred.
When?
In 1256 CE, or 654 AH, there was a massive volcanic eruption near Medina in the Hijaz region.
And it was visible far away.
Extremely. Contemporary scholars like Imam Nawawi and Ibn Kathir documented it. They reported the fire was so intense its light could be seen in Busra, in southern Syria, hundreds of miles away, bright enough to illuminate the necks of camels at night.
So this specific sign is considered fulfilled historically.
Yes, confirmed by historical accounts from the time. A past sign of the hour already witnessed.
Okay, so to wrap this all up, the article essentially interprets almost all the major signs of the hour symbolically, mapping them onto significant historical events and processes, mostly concentrated from the colonial era through the 20th century.
That's the core argument. Sun from the West, Western dominance, Dajjal, Communism, USSR, Gog and Magog, European nations colonialism, WWII, ISIS descent, U.S. role in WWII Cold War, smoke, industrial pollution, landslides, regional collapses in Iraq, Libya, Yemen, fire from Hijaz, 1256 volcano.
And the stated purpose is understanding God's power working through history, identifying our current era in this prophetic context, and reaffirming that no new religious duties arise from this knowledge.
Exactly. It's presented as a framework for understanding the sweep of recent history through a specific theological lens.
It's definitely comprehensive and provocative interpretation. It really makes you think differently about how prophecy and history might intertwine.
It certainly does. It takes these ancient texts and applies them in a very modern, historically grounded way. Whether one agrees with every specific interpretation or not, it pushes us to consider the deeper patterns and forces at play.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a question, perhaps. If history unfolds in such patterns, mirroring these ancient signs, what does that suggest about the forces still shaping our world today and how we might recognize them? Something to ponder.
A very relevant question to consider.